first part, I'll talk a little bit about hearing in general and music in particular. And for the second part, I'll talk about hearing words, so spoken language. So, as with other sensors, our sensors aren't just there to detect things that are in the environment. They're there effectively to construct a model of what is out there in the environment. So the signal that lands on our ears is made up of kind of a blend of lots of different sound sources that might be around at the same time. And what your brain is effectively having to do is to kind of parse those into discrete objects, put them into different spatial locations, decide what is an object, what isn't, and so on. So again, your input stream is this relatively undifferentiated, bouncing around on your inner ear, and what your brain is effectively trying to do is extract out where, what, how, and so on, all these kinds of other inferential questions. It's not just a question of detecting that there is a sound source out there, for instance. So as most of you know, sounds are to do with vibrations, typically vibrations of air. So pressure changes as a result of kind of pushing air out of the mouth, or vibrating strings on a violin, and so on. So changes of air pressure kind of oscillating the air molecules. And the way we can think about the change in pressure is that the change in pressure changes over time. And here, when you plot pressure against time, you get these kind of what are called sine waves that represent the kind of constitutive of what we think of as sound. So it's not necessarily that the molecules are kind of traveling through space in a sine wave, it's rather that they're vibrating in space, and as you kind of plot those vibrations over time, you get this sine wave. Okay, so it takes a little bit of unpacking what this actually means at the level of physics, and you're not physicists, so I know that. But what is important to know is what different properties of the sound wave mean in terms of the psychology of sound. What is it we hear? We can think of sound as having a number of properties. What is its pitch? So high and low, this kind of ordered series, and the other is its loudness. And these have correspondences in terms of the frequency. So here, this is high pitch. It's where things kind of vibrate very fast, if you will. The frequency there. So how frequently the pressure changes. And loudness is related to the amplitude, so how big these kind of cycles are. So a loud sound will oscillate like this, if you will. And a high frequency loud sound will oscillate like this really fast. Okay? So this is how it works. And when you've got a simple kind of oscillation like this, it's what's called a pure tone. Most natural sounds, such as speech or musical instruments, are made up of lots of different frequencies and lots of different loudnesses all together in a simple sound source. And this is here that you've effectively got a single sound, but it's made up of different pitches, perhaps varying in loudness. And most of the sounds you hear in the natural world are like that. So even though a sound is coming from a single source, a single object in a single location, it's typically made up of multiple frequencies and multiple loudness. So you can't just kind of figure out, what objects are out there just by tuning into single frequencies, single loudness. It's more complex than that. It's about how things change over time. But that's how sounds work. So obviously your auditory nerve kind of is processed along several routes on the way to the brain. And here, I won't go through the anatomy in detail. All I want to point out is that it's kind of analogous to vision in many respects, and that you've got these kind of processing stations. So in vision, you've got something called the lateral genicular nucleus. In sound, you've got the medial genicular nucleus, and you've got other processing stations on the way. One way in which it does differ from vision is that you actually have more synapses to get to the auditory cortex. In vision, to get to the visual cortex, you've just effectively got one in the brain at the LGN. Here, you've got other ones. So the signal that gets to the cortex in hearing is already a lot more processed than it is in vision. So you do have these differences. And also, there's a lot more evidence of information going back down as well as up. So your auditory cortex affects these lower things here. It's not just feeding up, it goes in both directions here. So if anything, it's somewhat more complex. So just as in vision, you've got your primary visual cortex, also known as V1. In hearing, you've got your primary auditory cortex, also known as A1. And this is just defined as being the first region of the cortex that receives information from sounds. It's not the first region of the brain, so you've got all these other regions, but the first region of your cortex, the bit on the outside that processes things in detail, is involved in conscious perception of sounds and so on. So your primary auditory cortex is made up of different regions. One is called the core region in the middle, and then you've got a belt and a parabelt, which are kind of like other regions outside of that. So just as in vision you've got primary visual cortex and hearing primary auditory cortex, the structure of those differs according to the type of information that's sent in. So remember, in vision you've got what's called a Retina Centric Map, and what this means is that different points on the retina project to different points on the cortex. So it's almost as if you've kind of got an image in your visual cortex. Of course it's not an image because there's no light, but the activation of neurons is spatially organized in your visual cortex according to the spatial organization on your retina, which corresponds to spatial organization out there. In your hearing system, it's not organized spatially. It's organized what's called tonotopically, and it's almost as if you have keyboard-style representations in your auditory cortex. You've got some regions of your auditory cortex that respond to low pitch, some to high pitch, some to middle pitch. So you're dividing it according to this. And your left and your right auditory cortex have the same kinds of representations, but partly separated according to where things are in space. So this would be 4,000 hertz, but it would partly depend on where it was coming from, the side of space and so on. So you have got some spatial information here, but essentially the thing that's represented is the pitch of that, or the frequency. So you could imagine this is kind of having a keyboard-like representation there. And this kind of reflects the way that the ear and the auditory nerve kind of organise, that the organisation that was present there is kind of projected up to the level of the brain. So in blue, you've kind of got your core region of the auditory cortex, then your belt and your parabelt, and this is kind of dealing with more complex information, so you've got a hierarchy that I'll kind of explain. And then also, you've got this notion of two roots from the auditory cortex, which again parallels that in vision. So we talked about the ventral and the dorsal stream there, where the ventral stream is what's processing, deciding what objects are there, and the dorsal stream kind of where and how things are happening. And the idea is you've got the same thing here. So whereas your visual cortex is there, one projecting this way, one projecting that way, you've got the same thing coming out of your auditory cortex. One is primarily spatial information, one is primarily what is this sound. So we will unpack that. So this is the just a summary of how the auditory system works and how it's similar and different to the visual system. So in both cases, you've got this kind of intermediate station between there in the thalamus, your medial genicular nucleus that projects to there. You've got different organising principles, though. In the auditory system, you've got this tonotopic mapping. Different frequencies are represented in different parts of the brain. In the visual system, you've got retinotopic. Different regions of space are represented primarily in the brain. And you've also got different sensitivities. So your visual system is very good at locating where things are in space, partly as a result of that kind of mapping. In the auditory system, it's better than vision in some respects. It's very good at finding where things happen. So deciding when, sorry, not where, when. So temporal is when. So counting of clicks or deciding how clicks are spaced in time. Your auditory system is very good at processing that kind of information. Okay. In vision, I haven't talked about this yet. One very clear principle is that beyond the early visual cortex, you have specialized centers, so something that's specialized for color, something specialized for movement, something for faces and so on. It's far less well documented in hearing, but there is claim that there might be something that corresponds to to say pitch or to different voices, for instance. This kind of centre has been documented that discriminates between one person's voice and another. But this is quite modern research, and it's certainly not as clear cut as perhaps it is in vision. And then the idea is that after the basic auditory cortex, you've got this separation into different kinds of information in terms of what and where, and that this happens in both. So that's kind of a very basic overview. We'll now kind of just step into this in a little bit more detail and talk about some kind of concrete evidence for how it works. So what you find in hearing is this kind of hierarchical structure that you build complex sounds from simple primitives. So in your earliest region of the auditory cortex, the thing that receives the projections from the ear first, what you find is that neurons respond to certain frequencies, to certain what are called pure tones. So you might have a neuron that responds to 200 hertz, but then it wouldn't respond to 300 hertz or 400 hertz. So it's kind of tuned to one particular frequency, for instance. And then what you find in higher regions of the brain is you find neurons that respond to a band of frequencies or respond to one frequency after another. So you might have a neuron that responds to a sound, any sound between 200 and 400 hertz, for instance. So it's responding to a range of frequencies, or a single sound that is kind of covering that particular thing. So a noise, for instance, has lots of different frequencies. So how does that happen? Well, the way it happens is thinking about this in terms of kind of hierarchies, just as we had in vision, that you've kind of got these point-like representations, and then you create edges by adding the different points up along the edge, and this is how you make bars and edges in your visual cortex. So here in your early region, your core, you might have a neuron that responds to 200 hertz, 1 to 240, 1 to 260, and so on in there. And then in the belt, what you've got is you've got a region that receives inputs from these. So it means when you stick your electrode in there, that it responds to a wide range of sounds, because it receives inputs from these basic units. So this is how you can create a neuron that responds to this kind of range of frequencies, because it receives inputs from each of the kind of underlying ones. And what you could also have, for instance, would be neurons that respond to, say, a descending pitch, so a or something like this. So you've got a neuron that responds to these ones here at time 1 and those ones at time 2. So you've got these kind of connections, but the order in which that they're switched on effectively affects the firing of this. And in normal speech or in kind of other sounds, this is what sounds sound like. They're not static over time, they're shifting in their kind of frequency and loudness. So this is how you detect them, as you kind of tune into different ones, either at the same time or over time. Another kind of property that they have is that if you've got a neuron that responds when a sound is on in this frequency, so this neuron responds if you present, say, a 200 to 400 hertz sound, it might also respond to other sounds when they're switched off. So this is like a center surround thing that you get in vision. That it responds when you project light onto the center of the receptive field, but only when you project it to the surround when you switch it off. So it's almost just responding to those frequencies, and it responds negatively to the sounds, to the space around it. But you've got the same thing happening in hearing here, that it just responds to those frequencies, it responds almost negatively to those around it. So you've got that kind of structure here.
Was that found after human weasel?
Yes, exactly. This is kind of in the last 10, 15 years that you've got the same kind of things happening in the auditory cortex. Yeah. So this is quite recent discovery that different sensory systems code that in a similar way. Yeah. So in hearing, it's lagged behind by a couple of decades to show that really it's similar to it. And also in these kinds of as you go away from the earliest cortical regions to more complex ones, you see these other kinds of patterning as well. So here, this is the tuning of neurons, particular loudness and particular spatial regions here. So a dark thing means that the neuron responds. So this neuron responds to sounds that are up here. So this would be contralateral. So you're recording from a neuron in this part of your brain, and it responds to sounds that are presented in the upper right field here, okay? But it doesn't, but only if they are of 30 decibels and above. So response, hang on, yeah, so I'm not really describing it's okay. So this here isn't space, this is loudness. So it responds to a sound over here, okay, both from the upper and the bottom, but only when that sound is a particular loudness. So here you've got this complex mapping that it responds to sounds, perhaps of a particular pitch, of a certain loudness, but also when it's in a particular region of space. This one here is more finely tuned. So this one here, you're recording it from, say, a neuron on the left, and it responds to sounds that are kind of in this region of space, but only for sounds that are of a moderate loudness. In this, you know, about 20 to 60 decibels, it would respond strongly. So it's kind of tuning into particular loudness, particular regions of space, and so on. So, yeah.
Is this in the core?
No, I think that these are typically kind of outside of the core, the secondary kind of belt regions and so on, where you have these other ones. So perhaps more kind of hierarchically arranged. So you would get these kinds of information. So again, outside of the core, the kind of inner thing, in the other, you also have more of a differentiation between what and where. So here, these are tuned a lot to where. So if we go back to here, this region in red is your kind of belt and parabelt, these kind of more complex sounds. So what you might find here is neurons that respond to particular sounds, but they respond irrespective of what region of space they're in. Okay? Whereas here, you might have neurons that respond to particular regions of space, but they don't care what the sound is. They don't care so much whether it's, you know, that frequency or this frequency. They're broadly tuned to lots of frequencies, but narrowly tuned to where it is in space. Whereas here, in this region, you kind of got the opposite, that they care about what the sound is, but they're broad, you know, they respond to a large region of space. You've got this different kind of specialization happening relatively early on in the cortex between what the neurons respond to. So the claim is that you've got these two different routes. So the what route is, this is involved in detecting what kind of sound it is. So in the case of speech, what is the word that's being said, but also who the speaker is, what kind of instrument it is, this sort of thing. The where route is obviously more to do with detecting where different sound sources are coming from, so you can act on them and so on. And this is kind of your parietal lobes, which is involved in space processing, in bodily processing, so you can orient yourself to the sound. You know where the sound is in relationship to your body, and so on. For instance, you're pulling that together, and also linking it with vision as well. So your parietal lobes, you know, the visual kind of where things are will be linked to that. So your multisensory integration with finding where things are. So what kind of cues do you use for locating sounds? So at the level of the auditory signal, there are various techniques that the brain can use for figuring out where sounds are. So one is time differences. So remember that your auditory system is very good at detecting when sounds are arriving. So if you've got a sound source from over here, you will detect it in this ear marginally faster than that ear, okay? And that's not something that you would get with light, for instance, where it's too fast for the nervous system to process those sorts of differences, but you can do it with sound. The other one is intensity differences. So here you can see that the sound is kind of in shadow. So it's not the case that a sound from here going into this ear would be deaf to that ear, because sounds kind of travel around the head, but it would be dampened and affected by the distortion of the head. So it would be less loud in this ear if it's coming from over there, but it's certainly not silent. It's not that you only hear things in the nearest ear. That's not how it works. But this is okay only for sounds, for figuring out where sounds are in the horizontal plane. How do you know where a sound is in terms of up and down, for instance? And this is much harder to do. Well, in fact, it's not possible really to do using these cubes. What's the way that you kind of, another mechanism that you have, which is used both for horizontal and for up and down, is to figure out how sounds get distorted by the shape of your head and your outer ear. So one kind of classic experiment that's been done is that they record. You've got a pair of artificial ears, these things here that are made of kind of plaster or whatever. You put little microphones in them so they record what the sound sounds like. You've got an artificial head with it, and then you play a sound to these made-up ears. Okay, so then you can see that the sound gets distorted by these ears. You can then put you can play the sounds into the person's ears, so they're not distorted by their head. It's just going straight into their ear canal. But they're hearing the distorted sounds that have been created by the artificial head. Okay? But and what you find is that people are quite good at locating sounds on the basis of that information. So this is one way in which you can create kind of real kind of sounds that feel as if they're out there, even though the sounds are just being introduced into the ear canal. You've got little kind of speakers in there. So what happens effectively is that your brain knows how sounds get distorted by your head, and it corrects for that. And another thing that found is that you're better at doing it if it's a plaster cast of your head and ears than if it's of somebody else's head or a generic one. So not only does your brain know how sounds are distorted by the head, it's kind of learnt what shape your head is and how that distorts the sounds going into it. And this can be used both for detecting things up and down and for left and right. And this is often what's called a head-related transfer function. And the idea is that it's kind of in this kind of wear process here, along this thing here, that's the kind of region that's implicated. That you effectively figure out where things are by kind of doing that. So what you might have here is that this is what the sound looks like. So here this is time, this is frequency, and the different colours represent loudness or whatever. But the idea is that that sound will sound differently in your left or right ear because the frequencies get distorted by your head according to where the sound is coming from. So that's the physical sound. The sound that arrives in your ear canal in your left and your right ear will be subtly different. And the idea is that your brain has learnt how sounds in the left and the right head are different, and it can effectively figure out what that initial sound is based on knowledge of the shape of your head and your ears. And that this is called your head-related transfer function. It's kind of in the first stage of your wear route. So it's a very kind of ingenious mechanism for doing that. Okay, and people kind of use this obviously in real-world context if they want to make sounds realistic. Is that you can kind of you don't actually have to do it as in the 1960s where you put little speakers in things in the head. You can do it on computerized models of sounds without physically recording them. You just adjust the sounds in the left and the right ear to make it look as if they passed through a head, in effect, or passed around a head. So audio engineers use this kind of technique a lot to make sounds spatially interesting.
Sorry, what was the name? Like, do you know what researchers did the study with the plaster cast?
Yes, it was in the 1960s. I will look at it in the break. Yeah, it's a strange name, but it's a one author name. There've been quite a few other studies since that have compared across heads and so on. But yeah. To remind me. So any other questions about kind of the basic kind of auditory processing, and then we'll move on to music. Okay. So music is kind of considered to be a human instinct by some. So there's no known culture that doesn't have music, for instance. But it's a puzzle because it doesn't have an obvious function in the way that language, for instance, is crosses cultures. So, a language has a clear function for communication. So people have kind of debated what the function of music actually is, and it's something we'll come back to later. What is music as opposed to other sounds? What is it that makes a sound musical as opposed to non-musical? So there are various things that are important here. A lot of people talk about music systems as involving a set of discrete sounds that are kind of repeated. So it's not that you've got an infinite set of sounds, you've got a discrete and limited number of sounds that are then combined in lots of ways. So in that way, it's kind of similar to language in that you've got a finite, albeit large, set of words that can be combined in this infinite number of ways. So here, if you think about a keyboard or whatever, the keyboard plays certain notes, but it doesn't play a note in between. You might have press this and get a C, that and get a D, but the note in between isn't there. Okay, it could be there in another system, but the idea is that you're segmenting a full range of sounds into discrete things, okay? And the way in which you play those sounds is what constitutes music. So that's one of the key things about this. So you've got discrete pitches that are presented in a series over time. So you've got your rhythm and your tempo. There are other kinds of properties of music that, again, kind of cross-culturally seem to be there in all kinds of musical systems that probably relate to how we hear. And what kind of things this is the idea that notes that are double in frequency sound very similar. So a note of 400 hertz and a note of 200 hertz are said to sound similar to each other. And it doesn't have to be these ones, it can be any ones. And in our musical system, this is what an octave is. An octave is a doubling of frequency between one note and the one above it. I appreciate not everyone kind of knows about music, but that's effectively what it is. The division of the octave into 8 or 12 units, how many notes are there between 200 and 400 hertz? Well, clearly there are an infinite number of sounds between 200 and 400 hertz, but musical systems divide those into a fixed number. So our one would have, well, kind of 12 tones if you include the black notes on the keyboard, and other musical systems would have other numbers. And again, it was previously thought that those are essentially, effectively made up, that they don't serve any real purpose. Different cultures change those, although we can talk about whether that's true, whether it reflects other things. So that's what music is in a nutshell, and why music is different from other sounds. Music, like language, can be decomposed into different mechanisms. So it's not the case that there's a music module in the brain, for instance. Rather, music is made up of different mechanisms. Some that are involved in melody and pitch recognition, others are involved in rhythm, tempo, others involved in memorizing tunes. Okay. Any kind of thoughts or comments?
It would make it really difficult to learn to play an instrument.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes, it's intriguing. I was trying to figure out at one point they said it seemed to be almost the auditory nerve that was damaged, or kind of the basic auditory pathway. But I don't think that could be the case. If you to be able to hear, tell a sad from a, happy to do.
Do we know what it is in individuals with autism's brains that means they can differentiate more tones?
In people with autism, they can differentiate more. That's a good point. So there are people who have these special abilities. So one is calling out, it's called absolute pitch. So everybody can say whether one pitch is higher than the other. So they can say, that's a higher note than this one. But most people can't say that note is called a C or a B or a D and so on. And some people with autism can do that. And it partly depends on musical training, in the same way as I wouldn't know that was a chair unless I've been told that as a kid. You kind of need to have this. But it's still being able to hold on to that information.
But it's still very, very defined in professional musicians. They can't do it.
Exactly, that's right. Yes, exactly. What you do find, though, is that people in China are better at doing it, and that's because their language has these kind of pitch things. Yeah, I'll talk about that in a bit. So part of it is a little bit cultural as well. Yeah.
So is it that she has trouble with recall of the structure?
Yes, this is what I think it is. I think it's I think it's more to do with the structure and forming a stable structure of the music, so all music sounds the same, means that she, this is a classic thing of what people with prosopagnosia say, that all faces look the same, that kind of thing. And it's almost as if they know a face is a face, but they can't differentiate them, or they can't hold on to multiple instances of them. So they can hear the tune, but then they can't map the tune onto something that is recognisable. But I did try and find out what case that linked to, and I wasn't able to do it. No, I couldn't find a better clip. So I think the jury's out on what that is. But we can talk about it maybe in terms of this model here. So the idea here is that this is kind of a modular type model of music. So here you've got your acoustic signal here, your basic sound. And the idea is that you represent different aspects of the sound differently. So one broad division is between pitch versus temporal organisation. So pitch is how high or low tones are. So something like Frere Jacka has a certain kind of kind of up downness to it. But you can play Frere Jacka either in a high pitch or a low pitch, and it would still be Frere Jacka. It's the patterning of that makes it Frere Jacka, right? Temporal organisation here is to do with the tempo. So again, it's how fast or slow it is, but even within a piece of music, some pieces are kind of how fast sections, slow sections. So the idea is that one is to do with the up-downness of pitch, and the other is to do with how it progresses in time. You've got these two levels of organisation. And within that, you've got other things, more subtle, kind of finer gradations, which, to be honest, I won't talk about. Here, this is an interesting thing here. So the claim is that when you listen to a song or a piece of music with lyrics, that your brain makes a broad division between music and speech, for instance. So when you listen to the lyrics of a piece, your language processing responds to the acoustic input, whereas the actual rhythm and tempo of the music is dealt with by separate parts of the brain. So again, you're dividing that up. So obviously, a music such as this would recognise Happy Birthday instantly if the lyrics were there, or Frere Jacka, because they're then recognising it via the speech and not via the change in the melody, the pattern of pitch over time. Okay, so that is so here this is effectively your speech system. What you then have is effectively a store of songs, if you will, that somehow you hold on to the songs you know. And this is what without kind of knowing anything more about that case, that would be my hunch from the information that was given to us. The idea is that you retain these kind of patterns in memory, and then you can match these onto. And as with, again, it's very similar to the kind of things we've encountered before, so with faces and so on, that you can process the emotion of the face separately from knowing who it is. So the idea is that you can know whether something's sad or happy by knowing whether it's, for instance, fast or slow. You can still recognise that there, or recognising, again, tonal encoding would be that a piece of music played in minor is typically seen as being sad and something made as more happy, that you can make these judgments. Again, whether that's cultural or cross-cultural or something that's learned, we can debate. But there are certain features of music that map onto emotions, either because we learn them or because they're innate. So that's the basic model here. What kind of evidence supports that? So you can certainly impair memory for tunes whilst having your basic, relatively basic sound processing intact. I don't think that this is the case that was on there, but anyway, Peretz, who's done a lot of research on the cognitive neuroscience of music, reports this case of somebody who lost a memory for tunes, so again couldn't recognise any familiar tunes, but could do before. So this was an acquired case. That's brain damage, and again was generally good at recognising different pitch. So deciding whether one note was higher or lower than the preceding note, for instance, the patient could do that kind of analysis. And also was quite good with recognising speech, including what's called intonation stats. Is this person asking a question or making a statement? So if you ask a question, you rise the pitch at the end of a sentence. And Australians do that even when they're not asking questions. It sounds like every statement is a question in Australia. But again, they seem to be able to recognise that. In dementia, what's found is that if you lose your semantic memory, your kind of store of knowledge and so on, you also lose your memory for tunes as well. So, in the same way as you lose your kind of knowledge for objects, more so on the right. So this is something we'll talk about as well, that a lot of music processing tends to be more right hemispheric and language more left, although it's not quite as clear cut, but it's broadly, there is something in that statement. But you tend not to get it with Alzheimer's, for instance, which is more episodic memory, remembering and discriminating between different episodes.
Maybe it's only a small thing, but have they looked into, if people have forgotten their musical lexicon, have they looked into their responses to music compared to before they lost that? So, for example, if they liked a song before they had dementia, do they still have a similar response? Or I mean, because that would,
yes,
it seems like it would be related to memory. That kind of.
Yes, that's interesting. It's not straightforward to do that, but that kind of thing has been done with faces, for instance. So people who, so these are people who were able to discriminate face and then lost it. And what you find is that when you show them a face of somebody, like a family member, they'll say, I don't know who that is, but you can show that they still have like a galvanic skin response, which is like an emotional kind of response to the face, even though they deny being able to recognise it. So it's almost as if you can get it from, you can get one measure from a degraded signal. So I don't know that has been done, but yeah. It certainly could be done. The thing about music is that it's quite idiosyncratic of what people know and what they don't know, apart from, things like nursery rhymes and things which tend to be fairly much shared. Rhythm. So again, so in general, I said that the right hemisphere tends to be more specialised for music. Really what we mean by that is that it tends to be the actual kind of pitch and melody discrimination. The actual kind of rhythm and timing for whatever actually seems to be a more left hemispheric function of music. So if you damage your left hemisphere lesion, then you have more problems in producing a rhythm. So tapping, you listen to something and then you tap it back, for instance, would be a task. Or in recognising whether two segments have the same rhythm or different rhythms. Whereas the right hemisphere, you have these problems with pitch that that you're asked to, you play two sequences of notes, one with a change of pitch, and it's more impaired with that. So the specific right hemisphere function seems to be more to do with this kind of pitch analysis and the melody. One idea behind perceiving rhythm is that really it's that what rhythm is, it's kind of mapping sounds onto the motor system. That's effectively one of the things that rhythm is that it's not a pure auditory thing, that in effect, even when you're just passively listening, you kind of activate your motor system. So again, it links to things like dancing, other kinds of movements, that it's almost as if it's a multi-sensory thing, a kind of process of rhythm, except you're mapping it to the motor system here. So a rhythm that you can predict what is coming next, you will activate your motor system. If the rhythm is completely unpredictable, so you don't know when the next note is going to appear, you don't activate your motor system. Okay? So again, it's almost as if you're trying to produce the rhythm yourself internally, and you're not just listening to that. It would be another thing that you use your motor system to predict that. And again, you can damage a rhythm perception without damaging pitch. So this is a family who have developmental speech problems, but they also have problems with rhythm perception. They have damage to their basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia is part of your motor system, or certainly involved in motor systems. And in imaging, for instance, your basal ganglia is important for keeping time to a rhythm. And if you have this kind of developmental damage to it, then you have problems with certain aspects of music perception. So again, this is suggesting that that there is the rhythm and pitch are separate, but it doesn't necessarily suggest that there is a rhythm module in the brain. It might mean that you're actually using your motor system to process rhythm or other aspects of general cognition outside of the auditory system. Okay. But it does support a general distinction between pitch versus rhythm that is central to that one. What about pitch and melody? So in recent years, so it's really only since 2000, there's been this condition called congenital agnosia. So these are people who are born with what used to be called tone deafness. So these people they don't listen to music, they find music sounds horrible or it all sounds the same. It's typically their kind of subjective reports. They can distinguish between da da, is that high, is that going up or down in pitch. They can make those gross judgments. When they're very subtle, they struggle a little bit. So it's not a very basic problem with that. Again, it's almost that they can't kind of lay down the patterns in music, but they can process music in some way. So here, this is a test battery of ability to process music. So if you're down here, it means you've got a low score, and if you're up here, it means you've got a good score. So these people in light grey are kind of normal music perceivers, and these ones in black have problems in interpreting music. And again, there's no brain damage as such. But what happens is if you look in their brains, you find that there are these structural differences in there. And one is kind of, it's not in the primary auditory cortex, it's in kind of higher regions. So one is in the frontal lobe, so not a sensory region. And this one here, which is kind of to do with, on the right, both are on the right hemisphere, to do with kind of more fine-grained analysis of pitch here. That's one thought of what this is. The thing that's puzzling about this is that you might imagine that if you're worse at something, you've got less grey matter. And it's not the case. The people who are worse at things have more grey matter in there, and the people who are better have less. And one theory is that what happens over development is that you actually kind of almost finely tune your brain to make it efficient. You actually have to get rid of certain things. So it's not clear what's being getting rid of here, but it's almost as if you're perhaps just tuning your brain in to certain styles or whatever, and that this is not happening in these people. That this effectively makes them deaf to music, but not deaf in the way that we would normally kind of understand that, because their brain isn't maturing normally. But it's an interesting example. Normally deficits are to do with getting rid of something in the brain. Here these people have more of it, more grey matter, thicker brains, and they're worse. Okay, yeah, the other thing about it is that they're good at rhythm perception. So again, it supports this dissociation between pitch and rhythm, that they can do that. So if you give them, they can tap that back, okay? But if you give them two sequences of pitch, they would say, I can't tell them apart, or whatever. Yeah. Is it specific to music? So these people with congenital agnosia, they talk, they speak. It seems as if they have good language, they can process speech and so on. But what you find is that you do find that they have subtle deficits when pitch is important for language. So, for instance, if you were to transpose what I'm saying now into a much higher pitch, you would still be able to tell what I'm saying. It would just sound as if I'm a woman, or that I'm talking squeaky or whatever. But you would still recognise what I'm saying. Okay. So the actual pitch in which a person speaks doesn't give you a clue as to what the content of their speech is. Okay. But it is important in language for other things. So, for instance, the pragmatics of language here, the kind of the contour of speech does matter. So, for instance, knowing whether somebody is asking a question or something, you would rise the pitch at the end. And what you find is that these people are impaired at understanding language when you give them these kinds of discriminations. Is that person asking a question or making a statement using those kind of pitch cues? Also, this relates to what was asked before, is that there are some languages that are called tonal languages. So a lot of East Asian languages are like this. And what this means is that whether, so I could say table, 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 you know, but to you it's all table, okay? Whether I say table with a rising pitch or a descending pitch, it doesn't change the meaning of the word. If you're a Chinese speaker, then the word ma would change from mom to num to horse to scold, depending on whether you kind of raise the A or put the A down. Is there going to be a Chinese speaker here? I guess you're not looking at faces, but anyway. So have a listen to this. I can't, it's not related to that, but you'll figure it out.
Ma, 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 ma.
Okay, so it's not in the order of them here. But the point is that to us, we just hear ma said in 4 different ways. To a Chinese person, they're hearing 4 very different words, okay, that mean very different things. Okay? And what you find is that if you have this congenital amusia, those words all sound the same, all kind of mean the same thing. You struggle to disambiguate them. Obviously, in natural speech, you don't have this problem because you're going to know whether somebody's talking about a horse or about the word none. Okay, so you can disambiguate based on the semantic context. But if you just give them the sounds that they're called that. So in Chinese, you have to develop your pitch processing in rather different ways. And that's why in China, people are more likely to have this kind of absolute pitch, that they're very good at telling you what the exact notes are, because their language system requires you to process pitch in a very different way than it does in our culture. So again, what we find is that music tends to be more impaired simply because in music you have to know the absolute, or you have to know, for instance, whether a note is going from C to G, for instance. It's not just enough to know that the note is going up. You need to know what the difference is in order to figure out whether that tune is correct or incorrect. And for language, you don't need that. You can just do it based on the overall contours, and so you don't need that kind of finer analysis. What about, so timbre is kind of distinguishing one instrument from another, so distinguishing a piano from a clarinet. And typically, if you've got 2 which are kind of matched in pitch, the way you do it is that you look at how the sound changes over time, and so on. So that wasn't in their model, but it seems to be another kind of skill that can go down. And in motion, you can selectively impair emotion. So in this model here, you've got that thing here. If you damage emotional parts of your brain, such as your amygdala, which is involved in recognizing emotions generally, then you struggle to recognize certain emotional motifs in music. So if you're played something like the Jaws theme, which has this kind of the patients don't report this as being scary if you have damage to your amygdala, for instance. They don't respond to music like that. So that's one line of evidence. And also, if you play kind of scary music relative to happy music, you will activate the parts of the brain involved in fear, such as the amygdala, your kind of anxiety network, and so on. You might wonder whether this is kind of just something that is a style in Western music, and it isn't. So there's a study that was done by Stefan Kolsch, who used to be a lecturer here for a year or 2 actually, and he went to this African tribe, played them Western music, and sort of found that they could tell when a piece of music was denoting scariness versus happiness and so on. It doesn't work with all things, but there's certainly some kind of musical styles which are recognised, across cultures. So in fear, it's the staccato kind of, it's not smooth music. It's kind of got this, in a low register, this kind of thing, not high pitched. Well, so recognising speech is the last thing that I'll talk about. This leads into the lecture on language next week. One of the things about speech that I'm sure you've kind of seen this sort of thing before. So here, this is time across there. Up here is the frequency. So this is like a spectrum. The darkness is how loud it is. So vowels have these kind of bars of certain frequencies called formants here. So these are your vowel sounds. And then there are these kind of silent bits in them. But the silent bits aren't the gap between words. The silent bits are when you go or whatever, that you kind of stop the stream of air flowing. So, and that can happen at the beginning of the word, in the middle of a word, at the end of a word, or whatever. So the bits of silence don't correspond to where the words are. So effectively, what you're having to do is take a constant stream of this varying pitch, intensity, and so on, and extract words from it. Okay. So this is your spectrograph that Joe took father's sheep etched out. So the idea behind speech is that it really is a playing or kind of parasitic on the basic auditory system as described thus far, but also depending on other kinds of mechanisms that we've encountered. So here, this is our kind of primary auditory cortex here, and then this is your kind of your what root here down the temporal lobes, and here these are your kind of semantic knowledge or kind of meaning of objects, the kind of things that's degraded in semantic dementia and that we've seen kind of impaired, in high-level vision and so on. That you would use there. So this is your kind of what root. In speech, we also have the idea of not just having a where root, but having what's called a how root as well. So just as in the visual domain, people talk about the dorsal stream as being involved in finding where things are, but also how, so kind of visually guided action and so on. Here, the idea is that you've got auditory mapping onto the motor system using the same kind of route. And the idea here is that this is involved in, say, the tapping thing that we've talked about, that you listen to a rhythm and you activate your motor system. In speech, it's the idea that when you hear somebody speaking, you kind of almost echo back the motor commands for speaking yourself. It's the idea that this helps you to understand speech. So some people argue that there's a motor theory of speech perception, that you understand that one way of segmenting this into different words is that you map it onto your motor system for saying the word Joe, the motor system for Tut, that this gives you those kind of units. In effect, one way of passing it is to do that. Obviously, that doesn't tell you what the meaning of the utterance is. It just gives you clues how to segment the signal, how to repeat the signal back, and so on. So the idea is you've got this bifurcation of roots there, but with this characterised more as how than where in the domain of speech. Okay. And also that this is involved, so this is involved in how as well as where, but this is involved in who, so also determining who is speaking as well. Is it that person's voice or the other person's? Is involved primarily in this route. So the what root, the idea here is that you've got these kind of patterns of changing pitch and tempo and so on, and that these correspond to phonemes like ch, sh, a, and so on, and that these kind of change over this short range here, that you would have effectively neurons that are tuned into these types of frequency change and kind of stopping and starting things here. And then you've also then got a hierarchy of other ones that are involved in multiple changes over phonemes. So syllables would be like three phonemes, like cat, pat, mat, mats, and so on. That here these would operate over a bigger range. Then you've got this hierarchical structure, in effect, of detecting phonemes, which are these sudden changes in pitch, versus medium, and then slower changes, which would be kind of stress patterns. So enjoy versus envoy, for instance, you stress the first and second syllables in envoy versus enjoy. The second one is stressed. So the idea is you've got this hierarchy, and that this hierarchy effectively starts in the primary auditory cortex and kind of goes along there. So functional imaging studies suggest that phonemes to syllables, kind of words, you go down here along this route with different kind of regions become more specialised, the larger the unit of speech that you're processing or attending to. And really what you're trying to do is that you're trying to match these units, these kind of sound-based changes in the signal, onto things that are stored in your head. So the idea is that you have a template of all the kind of patterns of phonemes that exist in your language, and that this tells you what the word is. So you can do this one of two ways. You can either map it onto an auditory store of what the words, or a motor store. So you've got these two ways of doing that potentially in there that kind of stems out of these two routes out of the auditory cortex. But that's the idea behind the what route, is that you're matching these sets of phonemes and syllables onto a stored set of what words sound like. And the famous model in the literature for doing that is Marsden, Wilson and Tyler's cohort model. And the claim here is that when you're listening to words, that you hear the words, you hear the start of the word before the middle of the word, before the end of the word. And that's very different from seeing the word, where you see all the letters at once. And the idea is that you actually start to match the sounds onto your store of what words you know as soon as you hear the first sound. So the first phoneme in this case, so a phoneme would be a s, for instance, in that case. So as soon as you hear a s, the idea is that you then activate all the words that begin with that sound, and you deactivate all the words that don't begin with that sound. So you're already kind of filtering through your lexicon, your store of what words, spoken words you know, even at that very early stage. So again, it doesn't depend what it's spelled like. So city, for instance, would be a sound in word. So, and then as you hear the next phoneme, then you would get rid of words like salmon and sesame and so on, and you would be left with speed and special and other words. And then you hear E, and then you're left with speed and species, and you get rid of those. The idea that you kind of home in on one, and then maybe it's a word that you've never heard before, and then you effectively kick out of the system and say, yeah, that isn't a word I know. So that's the claim that's made. The evidence for this is that you can look at what point a word becomes unique. So in this case, the word speed becomes unique after you hear the d. In the word like elephant, the word elephant becomes unique as soon as you get to the f. There's no other words in our language that are ella that end in any other way. So the word elephant kind of has an early, what's called uniqueness point, whereas some words you have to wait until the last phoneme before you know what it's going to be, or know that that's the only candidate left. And what you can do is that you can play spoken words to people and say, right, press a button when you recognise the word, when you know what it is. And you'll find that people respond faster when the uniqueness point is earlier in the spoken word relative to later. And this kind of provides the evidence for that. So elephants, even though it's a long word, you can recognise it soon because you get to the uniqueness point quite early on in the word. Okay, and other words you have to wait longer to hear before you can get that. So that's this model. The other thing is that it also depends on the words themselves. So it's not just on the uniqueness points. Words that are more common in the language are faster at recognising than other ones, even when the uniqueness point is matched or similar. Okay, so speed versus species, for instance, with English would be kind of the uniqueness point there. You're still faster with speed. Not just because it's fast, but because it's a more common word in the language. And people have kind of debated, well, what about, if words are in context or not in context? So if you're expecting to hear a certain word, are you even faster at detecting the uniqueness point? The evidence for that is less clear-cut, but I'll present some in a minute about that. So the idea in terms of the what route is that you've got this kind of hierarchy of kind of phonemes to syllables, and then you kind of match these onto real word kind of representations of these are the sound patterns of the words you know, and then you've got something else which is the word meaning, which is kind of at the far end there. Then you match the sound pattern onto the word meaning. But the word meaning itself can kind of, the arrow can point backwards and affect what it is that you recognise as well to some extent. So this is an EEG signal that's used for recognising whether a word, whether a word is a real or made-up word, but whether a word is kind of suitable in that particular context. So it's kind of to do with word meaning. So if you read a sentence like this, I take coffee with milk and a dog, the word dog here, I don't so these examples, elicits this large kind of electrical activity in the brain. It's about 400 milliseconds, called the N400. Whereas if you say, I've got a pet cat and dog, you don't get the N400 to the word dog. So it's almost as if it takes 400 milliseconds to get, to know not just that the word dog's there, but the word dog is expected. And you would get an N400 for this sentence here. The Dutch trains are sour. So even if you're not Dutch, you know that a train can't be sour, okay, right, or that it's kind of meaningless. So these are real words, but the idea is that this is the next step along, that you've identified that a word is unique, but then you need to know whether it's appropriate in that context. But you also get it for kind of real word properties. So if you read this sentence, the Dutch trains are white, most of you here would not get an N400 to the word white, but a Dutch person would, because in Holland the trains are yellow, they're not white. Okay, so again, to us, even though this is semantically appropriate, if your knowledge of the world conflicts with that, you will then get an N400. Okay, so it depends on your culture as well, whether your culture says that that's an allowable context and that will be not. So how can we link this back to the previous ones? So one interesting question is that this N400 is a marker of when a word is kind of being put into semantic context, that you know whether this word is appropriate. But how would this differ if you've got a word that has an early or late uniqueness point, for instance? Would this N400 shift around, or if a word was kind of expected or not? And so what you might expect is that maybe the N400 has to wait until the word is recognised, or maybe the N400 doesn't have to wait. And if it doesn't have to wait, it means that you're processing the meaning before you've even got the exact word out of there. Okay? I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. And the evidence is basically that they're not completely separate, that you don't have to wait for a word to be recognised fully before you get that. So here, this is an ERP study that effectively varies, well, it's not varying the uniqueness, it's varying the context of it. I'll come back to that. So if we read this sentence here, it was a pleasant surprise to find that the car repair bill was only $17, and here you're expecting dollars. That's kind of what you're semantically expecting. If you get the word dollars, then you don't get your N400 to it, okay? If you get the word dolphin or scholars, you do get an N400 because it's not going to be 17 dolphins or 17 scholars, okay? So both of these elicit an N400 because they're semantically inappropriate. But what's interesting is that the two words differ in terms of whether or not they're phonetically shared with the expected word. So with the word dolphin, it sounds as if you're hearing the expected word dollars, okay? Whereas with scholars, you know as soon as you hear the words that you're not getting the word that you were semantically expecting, okay? And what you find is that when you get scholars, that in fact you get your N400 earlier than with dolphin. So even though both of these are semantically inappropriate, with this one here, the onset is earlier, because here you've got a mismatch between the s and the expected d there. Whereas with dolphin, you've got to wait for the sound, you've got to wait for the fourth phony before you realise, hang on, there's something amiss here that I'm not getting the right semantic context. So it suggests that basically the processing of meaning is kind of happening in parallel with the recognition of the phonemes in this case. That it's not the case that you just process your phonemes, you map it onto the word form, and then you map the word form onto the meaning. The expecting the meaning kind of affects the earlier stages with that, okay? And the three processes are kind of happening in parallel, rather than being this stage and that stage. So that's the N400. What about And the idea is that this is kind of a characteristic of the what root. You're putting understanding the meaning of words. What about your how root? So the what root is involved in recognizing words that you can understand. The how root, if I were to say meaningless words to you, you could still activate your how root. So I can give you some gibberish word and you can repeat it back, for instance. And you can't do that using your what root because you can't get a meaning for it. And the idea is that this is involved in linking sounds to the motor aspects of speech, but also vision. So the how root is seen to be involved in the McGurk illusion, for instance. So people debate whether the McGurk illusion is happening in this part of the how root or that part. But either way, it is happening in this root and not that one there. So the idea is that you're taking your speech sounds and you're kind of matching them on to motor and visual representation. So in the McGurk, the vision of what you see is kind of giving you a distortion of that. So most people remember that from the previous one. So there's fMRI studies suggesting that it's the how root, it's not the auditory cortex itself. It's something to do with mapping onto vision and the motor representations of speech that drive the McGurk illusion. The other suggestion is that it helps in speech recognition. So if you damage the end point of this root, if you damage the motor cortex, you can still perceive speech, but it does result in quite subtle problems of discriminating, say, speech in noisy situations. And the idea is that this helps you can use your motor representation when the auditory signal is very ambiguous. So when the auditory signal is fine, you don't need your motor system to help you. But when the auditory system is not giving you a clear answer, as in the McGurk illusion, as in if you're listening in noise, then it seems to matter. So if you apply TMS to your motor system, it doesn't impair your ability to discriminate normal speech, but it impairs your ability to discriminate speech if the speech signal is degraded, for instance. So that's the evidence for this. It also depends on what is in your kind of speech repertoire. I don't know whether you've ever heard of click language before, but these, well, there's various, I think it's only in Africa, it might be in South America as well. There are certain sound like, or there are various clicks that you can do, there's about 4 or 5 of them. But anyway, to us, those are not in our language, to them, those are actual phonemes. So listen to this film.
Thank you.
So those noises are actually just the same as like a sh or a p to us. It's that they discriminate between words, whereas to us it's, we don't do that. So if we were to listen to, say, a language which uses all our speech sounds, and we can use our how root to do that. If we listen, when we're listening to Kosa, it's just a pure auditory thing. We cannot map that motorically on because we don't, even though my mouth can produce those sounds, it's not part of my speech repertoire. So I've not learnt to make that mapping between them. So to me, listening to that Kosa language is just a pure kind of auditory experience. Whereas if you're a Kosa speaker, then you will activate your how root as well, because you know how to produce those particular sounds when you speak. There's about 4 or 5 Kosa. It's spelled X-H-O-S-A. That's the name of this language. It's Southern Africa. Okay, so this is what I said before, is that the how root is kind of linked to the idea that the motor system is involved in recognising speech. But it kind of helps speech recognition rather than actually being absolutely essential. The auditory system can recognise speech without the motor system in most situations. It just provides. So that's kind of introduced speaking and the kind of 2 roots. In the next lecture, we'll talk a bit about how words are represented in semantics and how they're combined in syntax. So it follows up on some of the themes